Welcome to the Outrage Science Bites podcast, a companion podcast to the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm starting this podcast to coincide with something called NaPodPoMo. That crazy name, or that crazy hashtag, stands for the National Podcast Post Month. And what that is it's a challenge to post a podcast episode every day the month of November. 30 episodes, 1 episode a day. So that's what I'm going to do with this little Outrage Science Bites podcast. So what we'll do is, these will be short episodes, and primarily unedited, primarily unscripted. I'll just go by some notes, and these might have different types of little mini topics. Some of them will be about scientific phenomena we've discussed on the show, may even have little short guests. I don't know, but it's going to be 1 episode every day, so that's going to limit a little bit how much you can put into an episode. So I didn't find out about this challenge until literally the day before November 1st. So I didn't get 3 months to prepare for it and back up a bunch of episodes. So I'm going to record all these episodes in the month of November. So I guess this first episode, what I'll talk about is, before I even get started with that. So we're going to have there's another section on Substack, and it'll have its own Substack link. So if you want to find that, you can find that at outrageoverload.net and scroll down, and you'll see a discussion about this November challenge. And you can find there a way to get into the Substack section. And so these podcast episodes will not be part of the main feed. You won't pick these up in the Outrage Overload show. And also, they won't be sent out as part of the newsletter unless, every once in a while I want to make some kind of a reference to it. So you can subscribe to this separate Substack section separately. So this way, if you don't want an email every day for a new episode of this show, you don't have to get that, and don't have to be flooded with that, and your phone won't be flooded with that. But this will also have a feed that you could subscribe to in your podcast player, Apple, Spotify, or whatever, and you can listen to it that way, again, separately from the Outrage Overload podcast, because it will be 1 episode every day, at least for the first 30 days. What I do after November 30 with this show, I don't know for sure, but it probably will have more sporadic posts or episodes, and not an episode every single day. So the easiest way to find this is to go to outrageoverload.net and then scroll down, and you'll see a little box talking about the November challenge, and you can get subscribed to this on a separate email list, and also separately in your feed, or you can just listen to the episodes on the web over at Substack through following that link. All right, with that set aside, I think today I'm going to start with a couple simple topics. So I talked about how this show might talk about things like different phenomenon that we have talked about on the show, different sort of scientific phenomenon, and relating to outrage media, outrage porn, and all that. And so today I think I'll just talk about a couple quick ones, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. But one, a name that you probably have heard a lot, and you may feel like you pretty much already know what this is all about. But we hear a lot about confirmation bias, and a thing called confirmation bias. And what happened, and one thing about confirmation bias is that term can be overused, or even sometimes you might say misused, to sort of specify sort of a broad area. And often when people use that term sort of unofficially, they might actually be referring to something a little bit more detailed, and you can decide whether that's sort of accurate or not, because you can maybe say a lot of these other things still fit within this larger framework of confirmation bias. And I want to talk about that a little bit, and then I want to talk about a little bit about just kind of refresher on the scientific method, just a little bit. I know a lot of my audience is kind of familiar with that, but I often get people talking about things that make me sort of cringe a little bit around science and scientific method. So starting with confirmation bias, this is sort of what it says, is that what you're trying to do here is when we're practicing confirmation bias, we have an idea in our head where we have this sort of hypothesis, we believe this thing. And so we go searching out for the things that help kind of confirm that belief. And we'll kind of ignore the things that seem like they don't confirm it. And we'll justify that in our heads with like, oh, well, that's from a bad source or whatever. And I think people do that regardless of how scientifically literate they are. But I think, it requires some discipline to overcome those tendencies, because it's quite natural to want to do that. You have this idea, you kind of want to believe it. Your brain has told you it's a good idea and all the reasons you should believe it. So, of course, you're going to really enjoy when you find, support out there for that belief. So sometimes that's great, but you should also be looking for that disconfirming evidence. And again, you will check those sources and decide, what you think about those sources. And sometimes that's valid to reject a source. But, if you've got quality research sort of saying that there's maybe some people that dispute that claim, then you need to factor that into how firmly you're going to stay attached to that idea. And that can be a pretty uncomfortable thing to do. So I won't spend a lot more time on that. We may come back to this topic. It comes up a lot in different episodes. And at some of these little shorts, I might do some references to specific episodes. I think I'll skip that in this one. And I may even have time to edit in some clips. But again, doing an episode every single day is not a lot of time to go hunt down and edit clips into a short show. The other brief thing I want to talk about is, some fundamentals of sort of the scientific method in science. And I see this a lot, that people sort of say things like, I really believe in these spiritual practices, whatever that might be. And, I bet there's science that will confirm, or will support this. So I'm going to go out there and look for science that I bet confirms this, that I bet, agrees with this idea, the spiritual idea that I have, or that I've learned, or that I believe. And, this is sort of a version of confirmation bias as well, right, when you're doing that. And what I want to point out about, when it's something that's actually scientific, one of the attributes of it is it has to be falsifiable, right? So you have to be able to invent tests that could prove this idea, this hypothesis, incorrect or false. And if you can't do that, then you don't have science. And if you're not trying to do that, then you're also not doing science. But, for some of these claims that there isn't a test that could falsify it, then it's not really a scientific thing. So, I think that's one of the, obviously that's not all of the scientific method. And we might talk more about that in some other of these little snippets. But I wanted to kind of get that one out there, that's a fundamental idea to think about. And it kind of applies to the confirmation bias as well. But if something is to become sort of a scientific hypothesis and build up on evidence, then it must be falsifiable. So it must pass a lot of tests that could have falsified it. And as it, passes more of those tests, it might move from a hypothesis to a theory, which just means it's been through a lot of tests, and we, more or less consider it as seems like a theory that fits pretty well with reality. It doesn't, we really don't use the term, or you won't find scientists using the term sort of proven, because it's just not exactly how science works, right? It's just supported by a larger body of evidence, and that's really the base. It's the closest thing to a sort of a proven thing in science. And there still could be falsifiable things, maybe that only falsify part of this theory or this hypothesis, and then you maybe can adjust and say, okay, I've learned something, and I'm going to change this hypothesis or this theory in this way, or this one hypothesis about the theory has to be changed because it was proven in tests that didn't work. So I think that's one of the things I wanted to kind of just mention about science and scientific method is if your thing if you can't come up with a test that could falsify the idea, then it's not really science. So just keep that in mind, and keep that in mind when you're thinking about what other claims folks are making. Well, I think I'll wrap this one up now. It's already quite a bit longer than I originally planned, but these will generally be short bites. I really don't know the maximum length or the minimum length that they'll be, but they'll be shorter, obviously way shorter than our normal episodes. So thanks for listening, and look for another episode tomorrow. This is episode 1, day 1. I wanted to introduce the challenge, as well as introduce sort of a couple of these scientific phenomena or that we've discussed on the show. So that's episode 1, day 1. Look for another one of these little snippets, these Outrage Science Bites, tomorrow. And don't forget to listen to the Outrage Overload podcast at outrageoverload.net or on your favorite player.